The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Ethan Holloway knew this because he'd checked his pocket watch 3 times since tying his horse to the post outside Garner's General Store, and each time the hands hadn't moved as far as he needed them to. He wasn't a man who fussed over clocks. There'd been years on the ranch when the only schedule that mattered was sunup and sundown. But today was different. Today he was waiting for a stranger who was supposed to become his wife. He stood apart from the small crowd gathered near the depot. Garner's Crossing wasn't much of a town. A single main street with a hardware store, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, the general store, and a livery at the far end. Maybe 200 people scattered across the surrounding land, most of them ranchers or their hired hands. A few homesteaders trying their luck on quarter sections that wouldn't support a family through 2 bad winters in a row. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and half of them knew your business before you did. Ethan had lived here for 11 years. He knew which of that knowing was kindness and which was something else. He pulled his hat brim down against the afternoon sun and tried not to think too hard about what he was doing. The practical case for it was clear enough. The ranch needed a woman's hand, not because he was incapable, but because there were hours in the day when he couldn't be in 2 places at once, and one of those places was wherever Lily was. His daughter was 6 years old and had been growing up in a house that ran on stubbornness and canned beans since her mother died 2 years ago. She needed stability. She needed someone who wasn't always half exhausted and smelling of cattle and saddle leather. And Ethan, if he was honest, needed something too, though he hadn't let himself think clearly about what that was. The practical case was solid. The emotional case was something he'd locked in a box and shoved under the floorboards of his mind, and he intended to leave it there. The arrangement had been made through a correspondence agency out of St. Louis, 3 months of letters going back and forth. He'd been plain in what he wrote: the ranch, the work, his daughter, his expectations. He wasn't a man who dressed things up. He'd said he was looking for a partner in the working sense of the word, someone willing to put in honest labor for a home and a fair life. He hadn't said much about himself beyond the bare facts. The woman who'd written back called herself Clara Bennett. She was 34, a seamstress by trade from a town in Missouri he'd never heard of. Her letters were careful and measured, not flowery the way some women wrote. She didn't make promises she couldn't know whether she could keep. She said she was accustomed to hard work and didn't expect comfort. She said she was plain and that he should know that before she arrived. He'd appreciated the honesty. He'd written back that plain was fine. He'd thought he knew what he was agreeing to. He did not know about the birthmark. The stagecoach came in from the east, trailing a long tail of dust that the wind pushed sideways across the street. The driver hauled back on the reins and the team slowed, stamping and blowing, while the people gathered on the boardwalk leaned in to get a look at who was coming. There were 4 passengers. The first 2 out were a pair of men in town suits who walked straight toward the saloon without a word to anyone. The third was an elderly woman who was met by a young couple and folded into an embrace before her feet hit the ground. Then the 4th passenger appeared in the doorway of the coach. She took a moment at the top of the step, not dramatically, not like she was waiting for attention, but like she was steadying herself. Bracing. The way someone does when they've learned that the moment of arrival is often the moment things go wrong. She was taller than he'd expected, solid through the shoulders. Her dress was dark brown, serviceable, the kind of garment made to last rather than to be admired. Her hair was pulled back tight at the neck, dark with threads of gray at the temples. Her face was weathered in the way that faces get when they've spent years near wind and sun without much protection. And across the left side of her face, from just below her eye down to her jaw, spread a birthmark, the deep reddish purple of a bruise that never healed. It followed the curve of her cheekbone and ended in a soft fade near her chin. Not subtle, not easy to miss, not something she had mentioned in any of her letters. The crowd on the boardwalk went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they've all noticed something at the same time and are waiting to see what someone else does about it. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He was aware of the quiet. He was aware of people looking sideways at him. Clara stepped down from the coach. She lifted her chin slightly as she hit the ground, like she was trying to hold her posture through whatever came next. Her eyes found him quickly. She must have known who she was looking for, and she held his gaze with a steadiness that was either courage or the long practice of someone who'd learned to hide fear in plain sight. She walked toward him, stopped a few feet away. Up close he could see that her eyes were gray-green, alert and watchful. Mr. Holloway said. Her voice was even. She didn't apologize, didn't explain. I'm Clara Bennett. He was aware of Bud Garner watching from the doorway of the store, aware of May Whitfield from the post office pretending to adjust something on the boardwalk railing, aware that whatever he said in the next 5 seconds would be talked about in this town for a month. Miss Bennett, he said, you have luggage? A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, or relief so raw it hadn't finished arriving yet. One trunk, the driver has it. I'll get it. He walked past her to the back of the coach. The driver had already swung the rear compartment open and was pulling bags down. Ethan found the trunk, plain wood, worn at the corners, not heavy, and lifted it himself. Behind him, he heard Bud Garner say something low to the man standing next to him. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He carried the trunk to his wagon, set it in the bed, and came back to where Clara was still standing. She hadn't moved. She was watching him the way people watch something they don't quite believe yet. My daughter's at the ranch, he said. It's about an hour's ride. All right. You have everything? Everything I brought. He nodded and gestured toward the wagon. She walked beside him without asking questions. He helped her up to the seat. She took his hand briefly and let go as soon as she was settled, like she hadn't decided yet whether accepting help was something she was allowed to do. They left Garner's Crossing with half the town watching. Itchisam. The road west out of town followed a dry creek bed for the first mile before climbing through scrub grass and scattered cedar. It was hot, and the wind had dropped off to nothing. The wagon creaked. The horses moved at an easy pace because Ethan didn't push them when there was no need. Neither of them spoke for a while. He was thinking about the birthmark, not in the way people stare, but in the way you think about something that changes the shape of a situation you thought you understood. She hadn't mentioned it. He wasn't sure if that was dishonesty or self-protection. He suspected the line between those two things, for a woman in her position, might be very thin. He also kept thinking about the way she'd climbed down from that coach. The chin, the straightened spine, the steadiness of the gaze. Whatever else Clara Bennett was, she wasn't someone who crumbled easily. You're wondering why I didn't say anything, she said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead. You don't have to explain yourself to me, he said. I do, actually. You agreed to this arrangement without knowing something significant about my appearance. That's not fair to you. She paused. I found that if I mention it in letters, men don't write back. I know that's not an excuse. I just wanted you to understand the calculation I made. Ethan thought about that. Did you think I'd send you back? I thought it was possible. And you came anyway. I didn't have much else to go to. That was honest. More honest than most people managed. He respected it, even though it sat heavy. I'm not sending you back, he said. She turned to look at him then, just briefly, like she needed to see his face to believe it. All right, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the ranch. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might eventually be. How bad is it? It's functional. It's not pretty. He paused. It was prettier when my wife was alive. She had a way of making things. I don't know. She made it look like a home. It's been 2 years and I've managed to keep it from falling apart, but I haven't managed much else. He wasn't sure why he said that. He didn't usually talk about Margaret. What was her name? Clara asked. Margaret. How did she die? Fever. It went through the county that summer. We lost 7 people inside of 3 weeks. He kept his eyes on the road. Lily was 4. She doesn't remember much. Or she says she doesn't. Children remember more than they let on, Clara said quietly. Sometimes it's easier for them to pretend they don't. Yeah, he said. I know. They rode on in silence for a while, but it was a different silence now, less guarded. You have family? He asked. No, not anymore. She said it simply, without the performance of grief. My mother died when I was 17. My father a few years later. I had a brother, but we lost touch. Lost touch how? He was ashamed of me, she said. The birthmark. When we were young, it was easier. Children don't always understand what it means to be marked different. But as he got older and started caring about what people thought of him, having a sister who looked the way I do became, Inconvenient. She said the last word without bitterness, just factual. He moved away and stopped writing. That was 11 years ago. Ethan didn't say he was sorry. He thought she'd probably heard that enough times for it to be meaningless. And the seamstress work, he said. You did that on your own? I had a shop. Small, but mine. I made decent money for a while. A pause. Then the woman who owned the building sold it to someone who wanted the space for something else, and I couldn't find another location I could afford. I tried to make do in my room, but you can't run a real business out of a boarding house. She folded her hands in her lap. That's when I started looking at other options. Other options. He noted how she said it. Like corresponding with strange men for the purpose of becoming their wife was just a practical problem she'd needed to solve. Are you frightened? He asked. He didn't know exactly why he asked it. It seemed important. She looked at him again, and this time the look was more direct. Yes, she said. I think anyone in my position would be, if they're being honest. I don't know you. I don't know this place. I don't know how this is going to go. She paused. But I've been frightened before, and I've managed. The ranch sat in a shallow valley west of a low ridge, sheltered enough from the north wind to make it livable, but open enough that you could see for miles to the south. The house was a solid two-story structure built from stone and timber, gray with weathering but standing straight. The barn was big enough for 10 horses and had a hayloft that needed repair. The fencing along the near pasture was patchwork. Some sections new, some replaced 2 or 3 times over, some that had given up and were being held together by habit and wishful thinking. Lily was sitting on the porch steps when the wagon came up the track. She was small for 6, with her father's dark coloring and a serious, watchful face that had seen too much worry for someone her age. She'd been told a woman was coming. She'd processed this information with the focused intensity she applied to most things, and had apparently decided she would wait and see before forming any opinions. She stood up as the wagon stopped. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Lily said, "You have a mark on your face." "Lily," Ethan started. "It's all right," Clara said. She climbed down from the wagon slowly and came to stand a few feet in front of the girl. She crouched down so they were at eye level. "I do. I was born with it. It doesn't hurt." Lily studied it with the honest intensity of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude. "Does it wash off?" "No, it stays." Lily thought about this. "Papa has a scar on his hand from a fence wire. That stays too." "That's right. Do you know how to make biscuits?" Clara blinked. "I do." "Lard biscuits or butter biscuits?" "I can do both." "Which do you prefer?" Lily's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite approval, but was leaning that direction. "Butter. Papa makes lard ones because he says butter is expensive, but I think it's because he doesn't know the right way." Ethan, behind them, made a sound that might have been an objection and might have been embarrassment. "I'll make butter ones," Claire said. "And I'll show your papa the right way." Lily looked at her for one more long moment, then nodded as if something had been decided. "Okay," she said, and turned to go back inside. Clara stood and caught Ethan's eye. He gave her a look that was part rueful, part something else he didn't want to name. "She's direct," Clara said. "She's been the most honest person in my household for 2 years," he said. "It's both useful and exhausting." He started untying her trunk from the wagon bed. "Come on, I'll show you where things are." The house was, as he'd said, functional. The kitchen was large with a good iron range and a stone sink with a hand pump. The pantry was stocked but disorganized, cans without consistent order, flour in a barrel that needed refilling, dried beans in 3 different bags that had all been started and left half empty. The front room had a fireplace and enough chairs and a rug that had once been good and was now just a rug. There were photographs on the mantel. He didn't explain them. She didn't ask. Her room was on the ground floor off the back of the kitchen. It was small and clean, with a window that looked east toward the ridge. The bed had a patchwork quilt that she recognized immediately as hand-stitched by someone who knew what they were doing. She ran her fingers over it without thinking. "My wife made that," Ethan said from the doorway. She pulled her hand back slightly, then thought better of it and left it where it was. "She did beautiful work." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "The room is yours. If you need anything moved or if there's something you want different, tell me. It's fine. Thank you. He set her trunk down against the far wall. Then he stood there for a moment like he was working out whether there was more that needed saying. I want to be clear about something, he said. This arrangement, what I wrote in my letters, I meant it. I'm not expecting. I'm not going to. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. What I'm trying to say is there's no pressure about anything beyond what we agreed. Clara looked at him steadily. I understood the terms. Right, I just wanted to make sure. I appreciate it, she said. I'll start on supper if you tell me where the supplies are. He told her. She started. The first week was an exercise in figuring out how to exist in the same space without getting in each other's way. Clara was methodical. She moved through the kitchen and the house the way she'd probably moved through every space where she'd had to make herself useful without making herself too visible. Efficiently, without announcement, adjusting things slowly enough that nobody had to acknowledge the adjustments. By the third day, the pantry was organized. By the fifth, the kitchen had developed a rhythm it hadn't had before, with meals coming out at consistent times and lasting longer than the 15-minute affair they'd apparently been under Ethan's management. Lily observed all of this with serious attention. She didn't warm up easily. Clara hadn't expected her to. Children who'd been through real loss generally didn't throw their trust around carelessly, and Lily seemed to have inherited her father's instinct for caution. But she watched. She watched the way Clara moved through a room, watched how she handled things, watched to see if the woman was going to suddenly reveal herself to be different from how she appeared. On the fourth day, Lily came and stood in the kitchen doorway while Clara was working on the mending pile, a substantial collection of garments that had been left to accumulate under the apparent theory that a missing button could be ignored indefinitely. Papa tore his shirt on the fence again, Lily said. I see that one. Clara held up a blue work shirt with a significant rip along the left shoulder seam. I'll get to it. Lily came a few steps into the kitchen. Can I watch? If you want. The girl sat down across the table, folded her arms on the surface, and watched Clara thread a needle and begin working on the shirt. After a few minutes, she said, Do you know how to do hair? Clara glanced at her. Lily's hair was thick and dark and tied in a single braid that had gone crooked sometime that morning and was now listing noticeably to the left. I do, Clara said. Papa tries, but he only knows one way, and it always comes out wrong. What does wrong look like? Like this. Lily pointed at the lopsided braid. Clara set the shirt down. Come here, then. Lily came around the table, and Clara undid the braid with careful fingers and started again from scratch, working slowly and steadily while Lily sat very still. Children, Clara had always found, had a particular quality of trust in small physical tasks. The act of letting someone touch your hair was intimate in a way that conversation wasn't. Does it hurt when people look at your face? Lily asked. Clara thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. Sometimes, she said, when people look at me the way they look at something wrong or broken, it hurts. When people look curious like you do, it doesn't hurt. You're just seeing something different. I don't think you're broken, Lily said, with the flat certainty of a child stating a fact. I know you don't, Clara said. I can tell. She tied off the braid. Lily reached up and touched it, testing the evenness. That's better, she said. Come back tomorrow morning and I'll do it before school. Lily slid off the chair, turned, and looked at Clara for a moment with those serious dark eyes. Then she walked out of the kitchen without another word. That evening, at supper, when Ethan asked Lily how her day had been, Lily said, Fine. Clara fixed my hair, and she knows more than one way to do it. Ethan looked at Clara over the table. Clara looked down at her plate. Good, Ethan said after a moment. That's good. It was 10 days in when she first saw the writer. She'd gone out early to bring water from the well before starting breakfast, just past first light, when the sky was still that particular shade of gray-blue that meant the sun wasn't quite over the ridge yet. She filled the bucket, straightened, and looked out of habit toward the south pasture. There was a man on a horse, far out along the tree line, standing still. He was too far away for her to make out features, but something in his posture, the stillness, the directness of the angle at which he was facing the house, made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with memory. She stood without moving for a moment, watching. The rider didn't move either. Then she picked up the bucket and walked back to the house quickly, not running, but close to it. At breakfast, she didn't mention it. Ethan had enough to think about, and she told herself it was probably nothing. A neighboring rancher checking his fence line, someone passing through. There was no reason to assume the worst, but she knew herself well enough to know that the feeling in her stomach wasn't nothing. Over the next several days, she put energy into the things she could control. She reorganized the barn supplies. She planted a late kitchen garden in the patch of soil behind the house, knowing it might not produce much before the season turned, but needing the work of it. She took stock of what the ranch needed and started making lists in a small notebook she'd brought from Missouri. Lists of supplies, of repairs, of what could be done with minimal expense, and what would need real money. She showed the lists to Ethan one evening after Lily had gone to bed. He looked at them for a long time. His expression was complicated in the way of a man who doesn't like being shown the full scope of a problem, but understands it's necessary. "This is a lot," he said. "Yes. Some of this I knew. Some of this I didn't know I was ignoring." "That's how it goes," she said. "When you're running a place alone, you start making peace with the gaps." He looked up at her. "You ran a business alone for years." "A small one." "Still," he tapped the notebook. "This is useful. I mean that. I'm not—" He stopped, started over. "I'm not a man who's good at saying when something is appreciated, but this is. What you've done here, the first 2 weeks. It's more than I expected." It was the closest he'd come to a personal statement, and she could see it cost him something to make it. She didn't make it uncomfortable for him by responding to it too directly. "The fence along the north pasture needs to come first," she said. "If you lose cattle through there before winter—" "I know. I've been putting it off." "Don't put it off." He met her eyes. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "No," he said. "I won't." She found the rider again on the 11th day. This time, he was closer. He'd moved from the tree line to the low ridge south of the ranch, and she could see him more clearly from the kitchen window where she was washing up after the midday meal. A dark horse, a gray-coated rider, sitting very still on the high ground, watching the house. She stood at the window for a full minute, not moving, her hands still in the wash water. Then she dried her hands, checked where Lily was, in the front room with her school book, and went to find Ethan in the barn. He was mending harness leather and looked up when she came in. Something in her face made him put the work down immediately. "What's wrong?" She told him about the rider, the first time and this time. She told him clearly, without embellishment, the same way she tried to handle most things that frightened her. State the facts, deal with the reaction later. Ethan's expression went through several things in quick succession, settling on something hard and alert. He stood up. "Show me," he said. But by the time they reached the window, the ridge was empty. The rider was gone as if he'd never been there at all. Ethan stood looking at the empty ridge for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. "You know who it might be," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She held his gaze. She did know. There was a name she hadn't spoken in 2 years, a name that belonged to a part of her history she'd tried to close like a door and nail shut. "I might," she said. "Do you want to tell me?" She looked at the empty ridge, at the space where the rider had been. "Not yet," she said. I need a little more time." She expected him to push. Most men would have. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and went back to the barn. She stood at the window a while longer, alone. Whatever she had escaped from had apparently not finished with her yet. And she had the sick, cold feeling of someone who has run a long distance and looked back to find that the distance hasn't been enough. She didn't sleep well that night. Clara lay in the small room off the kitchen, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch settle around her, the creak of the house in the wind, the distant sound of horses shifting in the barn, the occasional call of something out in the scrub that she hadn't yet learned to identify. The quilt that Margaret Holloway had stitched with careful hands lay over her, and she was aware of it in the way you're aware of something that belongs to someone else. The rider kept coming back to her. The stillness of him on that ridge, the particular quality of that stillness, which wasn't the stillness of someone resting or passing through. It was the stillness of someone who wanted to be seen, who was making a point. She knew that quality. She'd lived under it before. She made herself breathe steadily and think about something else. The garden she'd planted, the list of repairs in her notebook, the way Lily's face had shifted, not into warmth exactly, but away from watchfulness. When Clara had redone her braid, small things, real things, things that were actually here and not out on some ridge in the dark. Eventually she slept, and when she woke, the room was gray with early light, and she heard Ethan already moving in the kitchen, apparently under the impression that coffee required a great deal of noise to produce. She dressed quickly and came out. He was at the range, his back to her, working with the kind of focused ineptitude of a man who has made coffee the same wrong way for 2 years and hasn't yet been told. She watched him for a moment, then moved around him quietly and took over without asking. He stepped back and led her, which she was beginning to understand was the closest Ethan Holloway got to expressing gratitude in the early morning hours. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some?" He nodded. He knew what that meant and didn't push it. She poured water into the pot and measured the grounds with more care than he'd been using and set it on the heat. "I want to fix the north fence today," he said. "I'll need most of the morning. I'll manage things here. There's a section near the creek bend that needs new posts, not just wire. I've got the posts cut, just need a hand setting them." He paused. "I was going to ask Denny Marsh from the next spread over, but if you'd rather I stayed close, go," she said. "Lily and I will be fine." He looked at her. There was something in the look that she'd started to notice over the past week, a kind of checking in, quiet and without ceremony, that she suspected he didn't do consciously. He just looked, assessed, and moved on. It wasn't intrusive. It felt more like the habit of a man who'd learned to pay attention to things that mattered. "All right," he said. The coffee came out better than what he'd been making. He didn't comment on this, but he drank 2 cups instead of 1, which she counted as commentary enough. After he rode out, she got Lily up and braided her hair and made breakfast, eggs and butter biscuits, as promised, and helped the girl pack her things for the school day. The schoolhouse was 1.5 miles down the road, close enough that Lily walked it with a group of neighboring children who gathered at the end of the track each morning. "Will you be here when I come back?" Lily asked, standing at the door with her books under her arm. It was such a simple question, and it landed so heavily that Clara had to take a half-second to make sure her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes," she said. "I'll be here." Lily studied her for a moment with those old soul eyes. Then she nodded and went down the porch steps and down the track toward the road. Clara stood in the doorway and watched until she was out of sight. Then she turned back into the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand resting on the doorframe, and she thought about what it meant that a 6-year-old girl had needed to ask that question. What kind of world had taught her to wonder whether the people she'd let herself rely on would still be there when she got back? She knew the answer, the same world that had taught Clara to brace herself every time she stepped off a stagecoach. She went to work. The house had bones. That was the thing she kept coming back to as she moved through it over those first weeks. It had been built with care by someone who understood what a house needed to be. Solid walls, good proportions, windows placed to catch the morning light. Margaret Holloway had clearly added to it with her own hands over the years. The quilt, but also the curtains now faded that still hung in the front room, and a shelf of preserves in the pantry. A few jars still sealed and labeled in handwriting Clara had learned to recognize as precise and slightly slanted. She didn't touch those jars. That felt like a line. But the rest of the house she moved through carefully, not trying to erase what had been there before, only trying to make it livable again. There's a difference between a home and a place where people sleep and eat, and the Holloway Ranch had drifted firmly into the second category. It wasn't Ethan's fault. A man running a ranch alone while raising a child doesn't have hours to spend making a house feel like a home. You survive and you keep moving and you tell yourself it's good enough. She scrubbed the floors and rehung the curtains after washing them. She found candles at the back of a drawer and put them on the table. She mended the split in the front room rug where the edge had frayed and started catching boots and turning it into a hazard. She restacked the firewood inside so it was actually usable rather than just decorative. She oiled the hinges on the kitchen door, which had been announcing its existence loudly every time it moved. None of these were large things, but large things are made of small ones. On the second Tuesday, she was in the barn looking for a box of nails Ethan had mentioned when she found a rocking chair pushed back behind a stack of old lumber, covered in a canvas drop cloth. She pulled the cloth back. It was a good chair, cherry wood, with a carved backrest that had a simple leaf pattern along the top. One of the spindles in the back was cracked but not broken. She stood looking at it for a while. Then she carried it out into the yard and sat down and began working out in her mind whether the crack could be repaired or whether the spindle needed replacing entirely. She ran her fingers along the split, feeling the depth of it. "Found that, did you?" She looked up. Ethan was coming across from the far side of the barn, having apparently come back early from something. He was looking at the chair with an expression she couldn't completely read. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I was looking for the nails you mentioned. I'll put it back." "No." He stopped a few feet away and looked at the chair for another moment. "Margaret used to sit in that in the evenings. On the porch." He paused. "After she died, I didn't want it in the house, and I didn't want to burn it, so I put it out there." He gestured vaguely at the barn. "It's been 2 years." Clara looked at the chair, then at him. "The spindle's cracked," she said, "but not through. It can be repaired. I can do it if you have the right glue and a clamp." He was quiet for a moment. "You know woodworking?" "My father did repairs. He taught me what he could." She paused. "I'm not suggesting putting it back on the porch. I just thought, it's a good chair. It's a waste to leave it to the mice." Something moved across his face, some internal weather she wasn't entirely sure about. Then he said, "The glue's in the back of the workshop, third shelf. Clamps are on the hook to the left of the door." He went back to whatever he'd been doing. She repaired the spindle that afternoon, set it to cure overnight with the clamp holding it firm. In the morning, she tested it, and it held. She left the chair in the workshop, leaning it against the wall where he could decide what to do with it. She didn't mention it again. Neither did he. But 2 days later, she came around the side of the house in the early evening, and the rocking chair was on the porch. The rhythm of the ranch began to find its shape. Mornings were for the kitchen and the house. Middays she worked outside when the weather was reasonable. The garden, small repairs, anything that needed doing in the yard. Afternoons she sometimes worked on mending or sewing while Lily was back from school, and Lily had developed the habit of sitting at the table in the kitchen while she did her lessons. The two of them quiet in the same room in a way that worked for both of them. Lily asked a lot of questions, not in the way of a child who wants attention, but in the way of one who is genuinely trying to understand how things work. She asked about the birthmark 3 more times over the course of 2 weeks, each time from a slightly different angle, as if she was working through a problem methodically. Clara answered each time with the same matter-of-fact honesty she'd used the first time. And after the 3rd round of questions, Lily seemed to have satisfied whatever internal inquiry she'd been conducting because she stopped asking and started treating it as simply a feature of Clara's face, like her gray-green eyes or the way one of her front teeth was slightly crooked. It was, Clara thought, the most painless process of acceptance she'd ever been through. There was something both sweet and a little devastating about the straightforwardness of it. Children, when they hadn't yet been taught what to think, sometimes just saw things clearly. One afternoon, Lily came in from school with a torn pocket and a certain set to her jaw that Clara recognized as the face of someone who'd had a bad day and was trying to carry it privately. Clara didn't ask what happened. She set out a plate of cornbread and a glass of milk and sat down across the table and started working on a shirt that needed a new collar. And after about 10 minutes, Lily said without looking up from her book, "Sarah Marsh told the other girls not to sit with me at lunch." Clara kept her hands moving on the fabric. That must have hurt. She said it was because her mama said the woman at our ranch was strange. Lily's voice was deliberately flat in the way of a child who is recounting something that was not flat at all. "She meant you." Clara set the shirt down. She thought about what to say and what not to say. "People talk about things they don't understand," she said finally. "It doesn't mean they're right. It means they're scared of something different. But you're not scary. I know that. You know that. It takes some people longer." Lily looked at her then. "Did people do that to you when you were little?" "Yes," Clara said. "Quite often." "Did it stop?" "Some of it. People I got to know well, it stopped. People who never got to know me, it didn't." She paused. The trick is that it can't be allowed to determine how you see yourself. That's the thing they're actually trying to do. Make you see yourself through their eyes. Once you let them do that, they have power over something that's supposed to be yours. Lily thought about this with her characteristic seriousness. Is that hard? Very hard, Clara said. I'm still working on it. Lily looked at her for another long moment, then looked back at her book. After a while, she reached over and took a piece of cornbread. It wasn't a resolution. It was a 6-year-old girl who'd just gotten a piece of information she was going to spend years figuring out what to do with. But the reaching for the cornbread, that small, simple act of choosing to settle herself, felt like something. It felt like the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. But Ethan noticed. He didn't say much about it directly, because he wasn't a man who said much about things directly, but she could tell he was watching the way Lily was around her, watching the way the house had changed, watching the way mealtime had gone from a functional necessity to something that occasionally resembled a family actually sitting together. One evening after supper, he stayed at the table longer than usual while Clara washed up and Lily sat nearby with her school book, supposedly reading, actually half asleep over the pages. "Lily," Ethan said, "go on up to bed." Lily started to protest, remembered something, and then apparently decided she was too tired to fight it. She closed her book, slid off the chair, and came to stand next to Clara for a moment in a way that wasn't quite asking for anything but wasn't quite not asking either. "Good night," Clara said. Lily leaned her head briefly against Clara's arm, just for a second, like a bird landing and immediately taking off again, and then walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't do that," Ethan said from the table. Clara set down the dish she was drying. "Do what?" "Lean on people." He was looking at the doorway Lily had just gone through. She stopped doing it after Margaret died. Just closed up. Wouldn't reach for anyone. He paused. "She did it to you." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know I noticed." "She's a good kid," Clara said, under the serious exterior. "Yeah." Something in his voice was quieter than usual. "She's better than I deserve most days." "I doubt that." "You don't know me well enough to doubt it." "No," she agreed, "but I've watched you with her for 2 weeks and I've seen what kind of father you are. That's something." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What kind is that?" "The kind who shows up," she said simply. "Even when you're exhausted, even when you don't know the right thing to say, you show up. A lot of men don't." The quiet stretched out long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much. She'd learned over the years that people sometimes didn't know how to handle being seen accurately. It could make them uncomfortable. But when she glanced at him, he was just sitting there looking at the table with an expression that wasn't uncomfortable exactly. More like someone who'd been handed something they weren't sure they'd earned. "I found those fence posts before it got dark," he said, eventually, changing the subject in the way men do. "North section should hold through winter now." "Good," she said. "You were right that it needed to be done first. You would have gotten to it. Maybe. Eventually." He stood up from the table, pushed in his chair. "That rocker," he said, without looking at her. "I moved it to the porch." "I noticed. It's a good spot for the evenings. Better than it was sitting in the barn." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Anyway, good night, Clara." "Good night, Ethan." He went out, and she heard the familiar creak of the porch step under his boot, and then the slower creak of the rocking chair as he settled into it. She finished drying the dishes. The sound of the chair came through the kitchen window in an easy rhythm, and for a moment the house felt like it was breathing. She saw the rider again on a Thursday. She was hanging washing on the line she'd strung between 2 posts near the side of the house, and she turned to reach for a shirt from the basket and caught the movement on the southern ridge out of the corner of her eye. By the time she turned fully, he was already still again. Same position, same horse. Closer than the last time. Her hands went still on the wet fabric. She forced herself to finish hanging the shirt. Then she finished the basket methodically, one piece at a time, not rushing, not letting herself look at the ridge again until she was done. Whatever that man wanted her to feel, and she knew the feeling well, the sick, pulled-down weight of it, she was not going to give it to him in the open where he could see it. She picked up the empty basket and walked inside. Ethan was at the far end of the south pasture most of the morning, she knew. He wouldn't be back until midday. She went to the front window and looked at the ridge from a different angle. The rider was still there, motionless, watching. She turned away and sat down at the kitchen table. Silas Crow. She hadn't said the name out loud since Missouri. She hadn't let herself say it even in her own head if she could help it, the way you avoid pressing on something that might crack if you press too hard. But she said it now, quietly, to the empty kitchen, because avoiding a name doesn't make what it belongs to go away. Silas Crow had been her father's creditor. That was the beginning of it, and like most things that look simple at the beginning, it became something else entirely. Her father had borrowed money when his business was failing, a reasonable decision that became an unreasonable situation when Crow chose to collect in ways that went beyond money. He was a man who understood debt in a particular way, not as a financial obligation, but as a claim on a person, something that gave him the right to a say in how you lived. Her father had died still owing him. Clara, at 22, had become the inheritor of both the debt and the claim. She had spent 7 years trying to work her way out of it, not because Crow held a legitimate note. Legally, the debt had died with her father, and she knew that now, though she hadn't known it then, but because he was the kind of man who didn't need the law on his side to make you afraid. He had a manner about him that was very calm and very certain, and that communicated without direct threat that he was accustomed to getting what he wanted and was patient about it. She had finally left Missouri 2 years ago, packed everything into a single trunk and took the first stage out. She had not thought he would follow her. She had believed, because she needed to believe it, that she was not important enough to follow. She looked at the empty basket on the table. She had been wrong about that. When Ethan came back at midday, she was in the kitchen making soup, and she could tell from the way he pushed through the door and went straight to the wash basin that he was tired in the particular bone-deep way of a man who has been doing physical work in the heat since early morning. She waited until he'd washed and sat and had a bowl in front of him before she said anything. "He was on the ridge again this morning," she said. "Closer." Ethan looked up from his soup. "South Ridge, while I was hanging wash. Same horse, same rider." She kept her voice flat. "He stayed for about 20 minutes that I could see. Then he was gone." Ethan set his spoon down. "How many times now?" "3 that I've seen. Could be more when I wasn't looking." "Clara," his voice was careful, "I need you to tell me who this is." She'd known this was coming. She'd been rehearsing it in her mind all morning, not the exact words, but the shape of it. How to say it without making it sound worse than it was, or better than it was. Or like she was asking for something she didn't have the right to ask for. She told him. Not all of it. She wasn't ready for all of it, but enough. The debt. Her father. The years of Crow's particular kind of patient pressure. The way she'd left Missouri, fast and with no forwarding address, through a cousin's contact at the correspondence agency who'd agreed to help her disappear somewhere new. When she finished, Ethan was looking at the table. She couldn't read his face, which frightened her more than anger would have. "You should know that he has no legal claim," she said. "The debt was my father's. Whatever he says—" "I don't care what he says," Ethan said. "You might when he—" "Clara." He looked up. "I don't care what he says. I'm asking what you need." She stopped. He held her gaze. His expression was not soft because it almost never was, but it was steady in a way that she hadn't encountered very often and that she didn't entirely know what to do with. "I don't know," she said honestly. "All right, then for now, we know who it is and we know he's watching. That's more than we knew this morning." He picked up his spoon again. "I'm going to ride the property line this afternoon. I want to see how close he's been getting." "Ethan, I'm not going to do anything stupid," he said. "I'm just going to know my own land." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you." He shook his head slightly, like it wasn't something that required thanking, which, she was learning, was his consistent position on most things he did. So, he rode the property that afternoon and came back an hour before dark, with a set expression and not much to say. She didn't push him. She made supper, and the 3 of them ate with Lily, talking about a spelling test she'd apparently dominated in a manner she considered worthy of a full report, and the normalcy of it was both a comfort and a strange kind of ache. After Lily went up, she came out to the porch where Ethan was in the rocking chair, the way he'd fallen into the habit of being in the evenings. "He's been closer than the ridge," he said without preamble. "I found tracks. East fence line, maybe 200 yards from the barn. He looked at her. Recent. Yesterday or the day before. She gripped the porch railing. He's not just watching, Ethan said. He's learning the layout. She knew what that meant. She knew it in the sick certain way of someone who had lived under that kind of attention before and recognized it for what it was. I'm sorry, she said. I brought this here. Whatever happens, stop, he said quietly. I should have told you. Clara. He said her name in a way that stopped the sentence in her throat. He wasn't angry. He was just firm, in the way of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not interested in revisiting it. Whatever this man thinks he has claim to, he's wrong. He's sitting outside my property line and looking at my house, and that's something I'm going to have to address regardless of what brought him here. She looked at him. The evening light was low and warm, and the rocking chair moved slightly under him, and she thought, with a sudden clarity that surprised her, that this man was not what she had expected when she'd climbed down from that stagecoach and braced herself for whatever came next. He won't be easy to deal with, she said. No, Ethan agreed. I don't imagine he will. He's the kind of man who doesn't respond to reason. I didn't say anything about reason. She looked out at the darkening land. The ridge was a black line against the sky now, and there was nothing on it, or at least nothing visible, and she was aware that the difference between those two things was exactly the kind of thing that kept a person from sleeping. You should know, she said slowly, that what I told you at lunch wasn't all of it. He didn't say anything. He waited. There's more, to who he is and what he wanted. She paused. I'm not ready to say all of it yet. I want you to know that I'm not hiding things to deceive you. I'm hiding them because saying them out loud... She stopped. Some things are harder to say than others. I know that, he said. You're not angry. No. Most people would be. He looked at her for a moment in the dim evening light, with that steady expression she was beginning to understand was simply the way he looked when he was paying attention. Tell me when you're ready, he said. It'll keep until then. She nodded. She looked out at the ridge and the darkening sky above it, and the first faint stars coming through, and she thought that fear was a funny thing, how it could sit right next to something else, something warmer and less expected, and the two of them could exist in the same person at the same time, neither one canceling the other out. The rocking chair creaked in the quiet evening. Inside, the lamp in the kitchen threw a warm rectangle of light across the porch boards. The ranch was not safe. She knew that. Whatever was sitting out there on the ridgeline wasn't done yet, and she had no illusion that it would resolve easily or cleanly or without cost. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not facing it alone. That was a new feeling. It didn't fix anything, but it changed the shape of things in a way she hadn't expected, and she stood on the porch in the warm evening dark and let herself feel it, just for a moment, before the worry came back. The tracks didn't go away. Ethan checked the east fence line every morning for 4 days after he'd first found them, and each time he came back with the same expression, not alarmed, but tight around the eyes in the way of a man accounting for a problem he hasn't yet solved. He didn't say much about what he found. Clara didn't ask for more than he offered. They had developed, in the 3 weeks since her arrival, a way of communicating around the edges of difficult things that wasn't dishonesty exactly, more like the mutual agreement of two careful people to let information arrive at its own pace. But the patience of that arrangement was running thin. On the 5th morning, she came out to find him at the kitchen table before dawn, which was unusual. He was normally a man who started his day moving, not sitting. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and his rifle leaning against the wall beside his chair, which was new, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at both of these things before she looked at him. He came onto the property last night, Ethan said. I heard the horses. Went out to check and found fresh tracks inside the east fence. He'd been near the barn. Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. Lily didn't wake up, he added, apparently understanding that was going to be her first question. How close to the house? Close enough. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I've been sitting here since 3 o'clock trying to decide the right way to handle this, and I keep coming back to the same answer, which is that I can't keep waiting for him to make the first move if he's going to be on my land at night. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I ride out and find him today and make clear that the next time he comes onto this property, I'm treating it as trespass and acting accordingly. He paused. but I want to know what I'm riding into first. I need you to tell me the rest." She had known this was coming. She'd known it since the evening on the porch when she'd told him there was more. She'd been moving toward it slowly, the way you move toward something cold, knowing it's necessary, still dreading the moment. She came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. She told him. She told him about the years after her father died, about how Crow had come to the house while she was still in mourning and sat in her father's chair and laid out what he considered the terms of her obligation. Not the debt, there was nothing legal left of it, but what he framed as a matter of honor, of family responsibility, which was the particular kind of language men like Crow used when they wanted something they had no right to. He had wanted her to come work in an establishment he owned in the next county, the kind of establishment that polite language dressed up in different words. She had refused. He had been very calm about her refusal. Calmness, she had learned, was one of the primary tools of men who understood how fear worked. She told him about the 7 years that followed, about finding work in town and losing it when Crow made it known she was under obligation to him, about moving twice to different boarding houses, about the careful, suffocating management of her world to avoid him while still living in the same county, about the way he never touched her directly, never had to, because the threat of what he could do was enough to keep the pressure constant. She told him about the cousin's contact at the agency, and about the morning she'd left with one trunk and not enough money and a determination so fierce it had felt like anger, which was the first time in years she'd let herself feel something that strong. Ethan listened to all of it without moving. His coffee went cold in front of him. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. "He never had a legal claim," Ethan said finally.
"No, I know that now. A lawyer in St. Louis told me when I was passing through. My father's debts died with him. Crow knew that. He was always relying on the fact that I didn't know it, and then later on the fact that knowing it and being able to act on it are two different things for a woman alone." Ethan's jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something harder and more deliberate than anger. "He's been following you for 2 years, he said. "I don't know how long. I don't know when he found out where I went. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought I'd gotten further than I had. How did he track you through the agency?" "I don't know. Those things aren't always as private as they're supposed to be. Or someone talked. It doesn't matter how he found out. The point is he did."
Ethan stood up from the table. He went to the window and looked out at the gray pre-dawn light coming over the eastern ridge. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, and waited. "He's going to come here," he said. "Not just to the fence line. He's going to come to the house." "Yes. He's waiting for a moment when he thinks he has the advantage. That's how he operates," she paused. "He's patient. That's the thing about him. He doesn't rush. He waits until he's certain. Then we need to take the certainty away from him." What that meant in practice, over the next several days, was a change in the rhythm of the ranch that was subtle enough that Lily didn't seem to notice, but substantial enough that Clara noticed everything. Ethan stopped going as far out as he'd been going on his daily work. He redistributed his time so that there was rarely a period longer than an hour when he was beyond sight of the house. He started leaving the rifle inside the door rather than out in the barn. He checked the locks on the windows. There were only latches, not real locks, and she came out one afternoon to find him fitting new bolt hardware onto the back door with the focused precision of someone who should have done it sooner and knows it. He didn't make a production of any of this. He just did it, the way he did most things that needed doing. On the third day after her full confession, she came out to the barn to find him talking to a man she hadn't met, compact and weathered, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that had made a lot of decisions in a lot of sun. Ethan introduced him as Roy Aldrich, his nearest neighbor to the north. Roy Aldrich shook her hand and looked at her the way some people looked, that quick involuntary register of the birthmark, then the correction, then the slightly too deliberate normalcy that followed the correction. She was used to it. She noted it and moved on. "Told Roy about our situation," Ethan said. "He's going to keep an eye on his boundary, near ours." Roy nodded. "I had a man try to squat on my south pasture 3 years back. Wasn't for neighbors, I wouldn't have gotten him off clean." He looked at Clara. "A man who comes onto another man's property at night isn't coming for a conversation." "I know," she said. Roy stayed for coffee, and the three of them talked about it practically. The property lines, the likely approaches, how long a man could watch before he had to make a move or pull back, It was a strange conversation, very matter-of-fact, about a situation that was in fact frightening, and she found herself grateful for the matter-of-factness of it, because it treated the problem as something that could be managed, rather than something that was simply happening to her. After Roy left, she said to Ethan, "You didn't have to bring him into this." "I know," he said. "I did it anyway. People will talk. People talk whether you give them material or not." He picked up the harness he'd been working on. Roy Aldrich has been a decent neighbor for 8 years. He doesn't gossip, he doesn't meddle, and if trouble comes, he's the kind of man who shows up. That's worth more to me right now than the alternative. She couldn't argue with that logic. She didn't try. Lily knew something was different. She was too perceptive not to notice the rifle inside the door, the changed routines, the way both adults had acquired a certain quality of listening that hadn't been there before. She didn't say anything about it directly for 4 days, which was its own kind of perceptiveness. She was storing up the question until she felt ready to ask it. She came to Clara on a Saturday morning while Ethan was out near the barn and sat across from her at the kitchen table where Clara was working through the mending pile and said without preamble, "Is someone coming?" Clara looked at her. She thought about the various things she could say, the softer versions, the reassurances that weren't entirely true. "There might be," she said. "Your papa knows about it and he's making sure we're safe." "Is it because of you?" "Yes." Lily absorbed this. "Did you do something wrong?" "No," Clara said. "Someone from a long time ago thinks he has a claim on me that he doesn't have. He's wrong, but that doesn't always stop people." Lily thought about this with the serious intensity she brought to complex problems. Like how Billy Reeves says he owns the corner of the yard by the schoolhouse, even though he doesn't. Something like that, except this is an adult man, so it's more serious. What are we going to do? Your papa is handling it. Lily seemed to consider whether that was sufficient. Then she said, "Is he scary? The man?" Clara thought about the truthful answer. "He used to seem very scary to me," she said. "He might still be, but I'm not as alone as I used to be when I was afraid of him, so it's different now." Lily looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I have a good hiding spot in the root cellar. I found it last summer. There's a corner behind the potato shelf where you can't see unless you know to look." Clara felt something catch in her chest. A 6-year-old girl cataloging her hiding places, offering them up. "That's good to know," she said carefully. "I hope you don't need it, but that's good to know." Lily nodded as if this had been a business transaction and went back to her book. He came on a Wednesday. The morning had been still and hot, the kind of day where the air feels thick and close and sound carries strangely. Clara had been in the kitchen since early, making a batch of preserves from the late-season berries she'd found along the creek bank the previous week, and the smell of hot sugar and fruit filled the house in a way that should have been pleasant and was, right up until the moment she heard the horse. One horse, coming up the front track at a walk, not hurrying. She knew before she got to the window. She looked out and saw him coming up the track. The gray coat, the dark horse, everything exactly as she'd seen it on the ridgeline, only now close enough to see his face. Silas Crow was 52 years old, gray at the temples, with a clean-shaved jaw and the kind of surface pleasantness that sat on top of something colder, the way a skim of ice sits on water. He rode like a man who owned the land he was crossing. Clara turned from the window. "Lily." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Go upstairs. Take your book. Stay in your room until your papa or I come and get you." Lily looked at her from the front room doorway. "Now please," Clara said. "Quickly." Lily went, quick and quiet, without argument, because she understood the register Clara was using even if she didn't understand all the reasons for it. Clara heard Ethan outside already. He'd been near enough to the house that morning to hear the horse too, and she could hear his boots on the ground. She picked up the rifle from inside the door and leaned it against the wall behind the door where it was accessible without being visible from the porch, and then she waited. Ethan was on the porch when Crow came to a stop in the yard. She could hear them through the open window, though she couldn't see them from where she was standing. "Morning?" Crow's voice was exactly as she remembered it, even pleasant, like a man making a social call. "You'd be Holloway." "I would." Ethan's voice was flat. "You'd be the man who's been on my property at night." A brief pause. "I've been in the area." "You've been on my land, inside my fence line. I've got your tracks to prove it, and I've got a neighbor who was watching the east approach 2 nights ago." Another pause, slightly longer. Clara could hear Crow calibrating, the way he always did, taking in new information and adjusting his presentation. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm here on a matter concerning a woman named Clara Bennett. I understand she's staying on your property." "She lives here," Ethan said. "I see." A shift in tone, barely perceptible. "She may have told you some things about our history. I'd want you to hear my version before you draw any conclusions." "I'm not particularly interested in your version, Mr. Holloway." Still pleasant, still even. Clara Bennett left Missouri owing a significant debt. Her father's obligation, yes, but one she agreed to honor before she disappeared. "I've been looking for her for 2 years. That's not the behavior of a man without a legitimate claim." "A lawyer would disagree with you." The pleasantness slipped just slightly. "Lawyers can be made to say most things." "That's probably true," Ethan said. "But I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not interested in legal arguments. I'm interested in the fact that you've been watching my home and coming onto my land at night and frightening a woman who lives under my protection." "Protection?" The word came out with a specific coloring. "How long has she been here? A month? You're a widower looking for help around the house. I understand the arrangement, but you don't know her the way I do. You don't know what she is." "I know exactly what she is," Ethan said. "She's my wife." Clara stopped breathing. There was a silence from the yard. They weren't. The words had come out of Ethan's mouth with a certainty so complete that it had taken her a full 3 seconds to register that they weren't true. Not legally. Not by any formal agreement they'd made. Crow's voice, when it came back, was different. Still controlled, but with an edge under it now. "Is that so?" "It is. We married last month. And that means whatever claim you think you have on her, you're now making against my wife and against my household. I'd like you to think carefully about what that means before you say another word." It was a lie. A clean, deliberate lie, delivered without a flicker of hesitation, in service of something Ethan had apparently decided in the space of a moment. "I don't believe you," Crow said. "I don't need you to believe me. You can ask anyone in Garner's Crossing. Clara Holloway arrived on the August stage, and we married 3 weeks later. The county records will confirm it when they're filed." A pause. "The paperwork does take a little time out here." She could hear Crow processing this. She could hear the shift in his calculation, the way a man like him accounted for new obstacles. "Even if that's true," he said slowly, "a wife's debts are not the obligation I'm interested in discussing with a man who comes onto my land at night." Ethan's voice hadn't changed volume or temperature, and she knew that calm, she'd learned what it cost him, and she found herself gripping the edge of the wall. "Here's what I know. You have no legal claim on this woman. You never did. The debt you're describing died with her father. What you've been doing for 7 years isn't collection. It's something else. And I think you know what it is. And I think you know what happens to men who do that kind of thing in a county where people pay attention. You're making a mistake." The pleasantness was mostly gone now. "I make them regularly. This isn't one of them." A creak of the porch boards. Ethan moving. "Get off my land. Don't come back on it. Don't watch my house from the ridge. If you have a legitimate legal grievance, take it to the county seat, but I'd advise against it because I'll be there with documentation and a lawyer, and you won't like how it ends." "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Ethan said. "A man who spent 7 years frightening a woman who was alone because he knew she was alone. You picked a situation that no longer exists, so I'll say it plainly. Leave." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that could go several ways. Then she heard the horse turn, hoofbeats moving back down the track. She let out the breath she'd been holding. Her legs, she realized, were not entirely steady. She moved to the front room window and looked out to see Ethan still on the porch, watching Crow ride away down the track. He stayed there until the man was out of sight. Then he turned and came inside. She was standing in the middle of the front room. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other for a moment. "Your wife," she said. "It was the fastest way to close off his angle," he said. He didn't look away. "I should have asked before I said it. I didn't have time. You lied to him." "Yes." "Deliberately." "Yes." "You told him we were married."
I did. He met her eyes steadily. If that causes problems for you, if it's not something you wanted said, tell me and I'll think about how to walk it back. She stared at him. You can't walk back a statement like that in a town like this. No, he agreed. Probably not. You knew that when you said it. He didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was choosing words. He was going to keep coming back, he said. As long as you were here as a woman staying on the property, he could argue access. That argument doesn't work if you're my wife. It changes the legal landscape. He paused. It also changes how a man like him thinks about risk. That's the practical argument, she said. It's the argument I had. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the solid, unadorned fact of him standing in the middle of his front room after just having done something that was going to reshape both their lives, whether they'd intended it or not. Lily, she said suddenly, and moved toward the stairs. Right. He followed her up. Lily was on her bed with her book open and her face turned toward the door, waiting. She had apparently not fully obeyed the instruction to stay in her room because the book was upside down, which meant she'd been at the top of the stairs listening. Is he gone? She asked. He's gone, Clara said. Did Papa make him leave? Yes. Lily looked at her father with an expression that was as close to open admiration as her serious face usually got. Roy Aldrich said you were the most stubborn man in the county. I think he meant it as a compliment. He did, Ethan said. He sat down on the edge of Lily's bed. He looked, Clara noticed, slightly more tired than he had 20 minutes ago, the way a person does when adrenaline starts to settle. You all right? I wasn't scared, Lily said, in the tone of someone who had been somewhat scared. Good, because there's nothing to be scared of. He reached out and briefly put his hand on top of his daughter's head. Not a hair-ruffling gesture, just a placement, a contact. You did the right thing, going up when Clara said to. Lily looked at Clara. Is he going to come back? Clara thought about the truth of that, which was complicated, and about what to say to a 6-year-old, which was less complicated. Maybe, she said. But he knows now that it's harder than he thought. Men like that, she paused. Men like that go where it's easy. We just made it considerably less easy. Lily considered this. Okay, she said, and turned her book right side up, which was as much a declaration of restored normalcy as any of them were going to get. Clara and Ethan went back downstairs. In the kitchen, the preserves had cooked too long and were just beginning to catch at the bottom of the pot, and she moved them off the heat with a cloth and stood there for a moment looking at the pot and feeling the shake in her hands that had been waiting since she'd first heard the horse on the track. She heard Ethan come in behind her. She didn't turn around. He'll tell people, she said, about what you said. Or he won't, because repeating it means admitting he was turned away, but either way, it will get out. I know. People will have opinions. They always do. She turned around. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, looking at her, and there was something in his expression that was very careful and very watchful, like he was waiting for something she might say. You didn't ask me, she said. No, I didn't. I know why you didn't. I understand the reasoning. She paused. I just want you to know that I know it's a significant thing. What you said, what it means. I know what it means. It changes things. Things were already changing, he said. I just moved the timeline. He paused. If it's not something you want, if the idea of it, when you've had time to think about it, I didn't say I didn't want it, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment with that careful expression. All right, he said. Then we should probably figure out what to do about the actual paperwork because I wasn't lying about all of it being slow out here. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, the kind of thing that happens in the body when the emotion can't decide which direction to go. The preserves are ruined, she said. I'll get more berries. The season's almost over. Then I'll get them before it is. He pushed off the wall, came to the stove, and looked at the pot. Smells like it's not totally ruined. It's caught at the bottom. That's the best part. He reached past her for a spoon, and the proximity of it, the simple, ordinary domestic proximity, was almost more disorienting than the events of the last hour.
He tasted from the spoon. It's fine, better than fine. She looked at him. He looked back. The moment had the quality of something that was trying to say more than either of them knew how to say yet, and she thought that was probably fine. Some things didn't need to be rushed. Some things were better arrived at slowly, the way you arrive at a place in the dark. One step at a time, feeling for the ground, until you realize you've been standing on solid earth for longer than you knew. I need to write to the county seat, she said, about the legal question, the debt documentation. I'll go with you, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He set the spoon down. I'll go with you. She nodded. She turned back to the stove and began thinking about what could be salvaged from the preserves and whether there was enough sugar left for another batch. And she listened to Ethan move through the kitchen behind her with the easy, familiar weight of a man in his own house. And outside the window, the afternoon was bright and still, and the southern ridge stood empty against the blue sky. And for now, just for now, that had to be enough. But she knew, in the way that the body sometimes knows before the mind admits it, that Crow had not been moved by fear. He had been moved by calculation. And men who operated on calculation rather than emotion did not stop. They regrouped. They found new angles. Whatever had just happened on that front porch was not an ending. It was, she was fairly certain, a beginning of something else entirely. The talk started the way talk always starts in a small town. Quietly at first, in the way of water finding the lowest ground. Clara knew it was coming. She'd known the moment Ethan said those words on the porch that there would be a cost, and the cost would not be paid by Silas Crow, who had ridden back toward town with the kind of rigid spine that meant he was already thinking about what came next. The cost would be paid here, in the ordinary daily business of being people who lived in a community and needed things from it. She felt it first at Garner's store. It was 4 days after Crow's visit. She went in for flour and salt and a spool of thread, the usual run of things, and Bud Garner greeted her from behind the counter with a particular quality of brightness that was not his ordinary greeting. Too much friendliness, too deliberate, the way people act when they've been talking about you and want you to think they haven't been. His wife Nell was in the back of the store and found a reason to stay there. 2 women Clara recognized from the edges of town were near the dry goods and went quiet when she came in, then started a conversation that was loudly about something else. Clara bought her flour and her salt and her thread. She was civil to Bud Garner, and he was civil back, and neither of them said anything about what was underneath the civility. She walked out to the wagon and put her purchases in the back and sat on the seat for a moment before she picked up the reins. She had been through worse than sideways looks in a general store. That was the truth. She had spent most of her adult life being looked at sideways for one reason or another, and she had developed over those years a kind of internal architecture for it, a structure she could retreat into that was not numbness exactly, but was something like managed distance, a way of seeing what was happening without letting it land directly. She picked up the reins. She drove back to the ranch. She told Ethan that evening, after supper, after Lily had gone up. She told him plainly and without embellishment, because that was how she handled difficult things, and she watched his face move through several expressions, none of which were the one she might have expected. "I'll go in tomorrow," he said. "You don't need to make it worse by—" "I'm not going to make anything worse. I'm going to buy some nails and talk to the people I talked to, and let it be known that everything is as I said it was." He paused. "Bud Garner is a good man who gets nervous. His wife is the one with opinions. Give it time." "Time doesn't always fix this kind of thing." "No," he agreed, "but nothing else fixes it faster." She looked at him across the table. "Are you bothered by it? What people are saying?" He thought about that seriously, the way he thought about most things, not rushing to an answer, but not avoiding it either. "I don't love it," he said. "I won't pretend I think it's nothing, but bothered enough to wish I'd done something different?" He shook his head. "No. People are going to say you were taken advantage of, that you didn't know what you were getting into. Let them. Ethan, Clara." He said her name in the way he had of saying it that meant he was done with the preamble, and here was the actual thing. "I've lived in this town for 11 years. I have 11 years of credit in that bank, and I don't mean the financial kind. I've shown up when people needed help. I've kept my word when it would have been easier not to. I've buried my wife and kept my ranch and raised my daughter without asking anyone for more than they were willing to give." He leaned forward slightly. A man doesn't spend 11 years building a reputation so he can spend the rest of his life worrying about what people think of his choices. At a certain point, you're either the judge of your own life or you're not. She was quiet for a moment. That's easy to say when the community respects you. It's easier, yes. That's not nothing. He met her eyes. I know you haven't had what I've had. The standing, the assumption of good faith. I'm not pretending that's the same situation, but I can use what I have to make space for you here. That's what I intend to do. She looked down at the table, looked at her own hands. She had spent so many years managing alone, working around the edges of other people's judgments, making herself useful enough that the judgments would be suspended, being tolerated, being accommodated. She had forgotten, or perhaps never known, what it felt like to have someone intend to make space. I don't know what to do with that, she said honestly. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. Just let it be what it is. He went into town the next morning, as he'd said. He came back with nails and 2 pounds of coffee and the information that he'd had a conversation with Roy Aldrich at the hardware store that had included 4 other men, and that Roy had, without much subtlety, made clear his own reading of events, which was that Crow was a man who'd been following a woman across state lines for 2 years, and that any other reading of the situation was missing the significant point. Roy Aldrich, it turned out, had a talent for making his views known economically. He said that? Clara asked. More or less. Roy doesn't waste words. Ethan put the coffee on the shelf. Tom Riley from the bank was there. He's been here longer than I have. People listen to him. He paused. He asked about you. I told him the truth of it, the way I understand it. He said he'd come by sometime if that was agreeable. Why? Because he's a decent man who likes to form his own opinions. He turned around. Is that agreeable? She thought about it. The idea of being examined, assessed, having someone come to determine their own verdict on her. She'd been through that process enough times to be tired of it. But she thought about what Ethan had said the night before, about making space, about how it worked in practice. Yes, she said. That's agreeable. Tom Riley came by on Saturday afternoon, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a neat gray beard and the kind of unhurried manner that suggested he had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. He sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked to Ethan about water rights and the state of the Northern Range, and after a while he talked to Clara about her sewing work in Missouri, and after a while longer he asked her directly about Crow. She told him the facts, clearly, without theater. The debt, the legal reality, the 7 years, the following. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, You know there's a judge comes through Garner's Crossing twice a year. Next visit is in November. I know, she said. We were planning to go to the county seat first, for documentation. Documentation's good. But a judge on the circuit who knows this county is better. He looked at her steadily. You'd need to file a formal statement about the harassment, about the nature of his claim. I know. It would mean going on record. People would know. People already know, she said. Or they're deciding what they know. I'd rather they know the actual facts. He nodded slowly. That's sensible. He looked at Ethan. She's sensible. I'm aware, Ethan said. Tom Riley left an hour later, having drunk 2 cups of coffee and given them the name of a solicitor in the county seat who he considered competent and honest, which he said was a combination rarer than it should be. He shook Clara's hand when he left, directly and without the overcorrection she'd gotten from Bud Garner, and said he hoped the situation resolved cleanly. After he was gone, Lily came out from the kitchen where she had been listening from the doorway, a habit she'd apparently decided was acceptable so long as she remained technically out of sight, and said, He seemed like a good man. He is, Ethan said. He didn't look at Clara's face funny. He's not that kind of person. Lily considered this. There should be more people like that. There are more than you'd think, Clara said. You just notice the others more because they're louder about it. Lily thought about this for a moment, apparently found it satisfactory, and went back inside. What came next was 10 days of a peculiar kind of suspended waiting that Clara found almost harder than the active crisis had been. Crow had not come back. There were no more tracks inside the fence line, no more riders on the ridge. Either he was regrouping or he'd decided the calculation had changed enough to make him pause. She didn't know which, and not knowing was its own kind of weight. She dealt with it the way she dealt with most things, by working. She finished the mending pile, started new curtains for the kitchen from a bolt of plain blue cotton she found in the back of the dry goods section at Garner's, got further along on the garden than she'd expected given the lateness of the season. She started teaching Lily to sew. Simple stitches, just the basics, because Lily's hands were still learning precision, but her patience for it when she was interested was remarkable. They sat together on the porch in the late afternoons, Lily working on a small square of practice fabric with the focused determination of someone who was not going to let a thing beat her, and Clara working on whatever needed doing, and they talked or didn't talk in the easy way that had developed between them. One afternoon, Lily said, without looking up from her practice square, "Were you scared when you came here on the stagecoach?" "Very scared," Clara said. "But you came anyway." "I didn't have a better option," Clara said, "and I wanted one, badly enough to get on the coach." Lily stitched in silence for a moment. "Papa was scared too," she said. "Before you came. He didn't say that, but I could tell." "Scared of what?" "Of it being wrong." Lily squinted at her stitch, pulled it out, started again. "Of picking wrong. He thought about it a lot. He thought I didn't notice, but I did." Clara looked at her. "You notice most things." He thought, what if she's like someone who just needs a place to go and doesn't care about us? Lily said this with the casual directness of a child quoting something she'd overheard without being sure of the full weight of it. "I heard him talking to Roy one time. He said that." "What do you think? Now that I'm here?" Lily looked up from her fabric. She had her father's eyes, dark and direct and careful, and she used them the way he did, not to evaluate but to see. "I think you care about things," she said, "not just because you have to. You fixed the rocking chair. Papa didn't ask you to do that." She looked back at her stitching. "And you always make sure I've got my braid even on the mornings you're tired. I can tell when you're tired because you're quieter, but you still do the braid." Clara's throat did something she wasn't entirely prepared for. "The braid is important," she managed. "Yes," Lily agreed seriously. "It is, yet." Ethan noticed the town was coming around in the incremental, unannounced way that small communities have, of adjusting their collective opinion without anyone formally declaring they've done so. May Whitfield from the post office stopped by one afternoon with a jar of her own preserves, which was a social gesture that carried specific weight in Garner's Crossing, because May Whitfield was particular about who she brought preserves to. She stayed for coffee and was straightforward with Clara in the blunt, no-nonsense way of a woman who has been postmistress long enough to have concluded that directness saves time. "You make that curtain?" she asked, nodding at the new kitchen curtain. "Yes," Clara said. "Good work. The old ones were a disgrace." She looked at Clara the way people look when they've decided to actually see you. "People are talking," she said. "You probably know that." "I know that." "Most of them are talking themselves into the right position. Give it another week." She sipped her coffee. "A man who follows a woman across 2 states because he thinks he owns her. People here have seen that kind before. They don't like it. They just needed to figure out which side of the story to be on." "And which side are they on?" Clara asked. May gave her a look that might have been a smile if it had stretched a little further. "The side that involves Ethan Holloway, generally, unless someone gives them a good reason to be otherwise." She set down her cup. "You're not going to give them a reason." It was not quite a question. "No," Claire said. "I'm not." "Good." May stood up, businesslike. "Bring that thread to the post office when you get a chance. I've been looking for that particular weight for 3 months and Bud never has it." She left. Clara looked at Ethan, who was leaning in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man trying not to look like he'd found something amusing. "Was that a welcome?" Clara said. "From May Whitfield?" He pushed off the doorframe. That was basically a parade. The legal matter moved more slowly than the social one. They made the trip to the county seat on a Thursday. Lily left in Roy Aldrich's capable care for the day. The solicitor Tom Riley had recommended was a thin, precise man named Frederick Holt, who had an office full of paper and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that urgency was usually someone else's problem. He listened to Clara's account with occasional notes and no visible emotional response until she got to the part about the 7 years, at which point something moved briefly behind his eyes. You have documentation of the original debt? He asked. Some. Letters from my father's papers. I brought what I had. He looked through what she'd brought. The letters, her father's partial accounting book, a note in Crow's handwriting from 12 years earlier that she'd kept without being entirely sure why. The way you keep things that feel like evidence before you know evidence of what. This is useful, Holt said, which she was coming to understand was his equivalent of enthusiasm. The notation here confirms the debt was personal to your father, combined with the absence of any legal instrument extending it to you, and a sworn statement about the conduct over the following years. He tapped the papers together neatly. I think we can construct something the circuit judge will take seriously. What does that mean in practice? Ethan asked. He'd been listening from the chair beside Clara, not interjecting, letting her lead, which she'd noticed and noted. A formal restraining order if the harassment continued after she left Missouri would be ideal, but we don't have that. What we have is enough for a declaratory judgment that no legitimate debt or obligation exists, combined with documentation of conduct that could support a harassment claim under territorial law. Holt looked at Clara. It won't be immediate. The judge comes through in November, but having the filing in before he arrives puts you in a strong position. Is there anything he can do between now and November that changes that? Clara asked. Holt considered. If he attempts to approach you again, that needs to be documented. Witnesses help. If he makes claims to third parties about the nature of your relationship or his rights over you, those can also be documented. He paused. The more clearly he establishes a pattern, the more clearly the filing is justified. They left 2 hours later with Holt's fee paid and the process begun, and a folder of copies of what they'd left with him. Clara carried the folder against her chest the whole ride back, not because she was afraid of losing it, but because holding something concrete helped. Halfway back, Ethan said, "You brought that note he wrote. The one from 12 years ago." "Yes." "How long have you had that?" 12 years. She watched the road ahead. "I carried it in the bottom of my trunk through 2 houses and a boarding room and across 3 states. I didn't know why for most of that time." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew you'd need it eventually." "Part of me did. The part that wasn't willing to fully believe it was over." "That part was right." "That part usually is," she said. "It's the inconvenient part of yourself. It won't let you pretend." He glanced at her sideways. "You have a lot of those parts." "Too many, probably." "I don't know," he said. "They seem to produce results." Tatek. It was Lily who broke open the question that had been sitting between them since the porch. She did it the way she did most things, directly, and at a moment nobody anticipated, which was Sunday breakfast when Ethan was on his second cup of coffee and Clara was clearing the plates, and the whole morning had the relaxed, unhurried quality of a day that wasn't asking anything of anyone yet. "Are you really married?" Lily asked. She was looking at her biscuit. The kitchen went quiet. Clara set the plates down. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Not yet," Ethan said. He said it carefully, in the way of a man choosing exact words. "It's something that it's being figured out." Lily looked up from her biscuit. She looked at Clara, then at her father, then back at her biscuit. "Because of the man who came." "Partly," Ethan said. "But also because you want to," Lily said. This was not a question. It had the quality of something she'd already decided and was checking rather than asking. "Lily," Ethan started. "I'm not complaining," she said. "I was just asking." She took a bite of her biscuit. "I think you should," she said, with her mouth still slightly full, which was a rare breach of the table manners she usually observed with surprising faithfulness. "I'd rather she stayed permanently." The kitchen was very quiet again. Clara found that she needed to look out the window for a moment, at the particular quality of the Sunday morning light on the porch, at the rocking chair still and empty in the early hours. "That's good to know," Ethan said to his daughter. His voice was slightly rough at the edges. "Just so you knew," Lily said, and reached for another biscuit. They talked that night. Not immediately after supper, balking. Both of them seemed to need the space of the evening to settle, the usual routine of clearing up and Lily going to bed and the quiet that followed. Ethan went out to the porch, and she came out after a while, and they sat in the way they'd gotten used to, him in the rocking chair and her on the step, the night coming down over the ranch with its particular darkness and smell of dry grass.
"I need to ask you something directly," Ethan said, "and I want a direct answer." "All right." "I told Crow we were married because it was the most effective way to close off his angle. That was the truth, but it wasn't the only reason I said it." He paused. "I said it because it's something I'd been thinking about before he came. How to ask about." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at this." "No," she agreed, "but neither am I, so it evens out." He looked at her, a faint something at the edge of his mouth that was almost a smile, and rare. "I want to ask you to stay, not as an arrangement, not just because of Crow or the ranch or Lily needing someone." He stopped. "Although all of those things are true." "I know they are, but because—" He stopped again, and she could see it cost him something, this particular kind of saying. "Because over the last 6 weeks, you've become someone I want in my house. Not in the useful sense. In the, I wake up in the morning and I want you to be in the kitchen. Not because of the coffee, although the coffee is better. Because you're there." He looked at the dark land. "That's the truest thing I can say it. I don't have better language than that." She looked at him, at the honest difficulty of it, the plainness of a man who didn't dress things up, even the things that mattered most. "I have a birthmark on my face that's not going away," she said. "I know that. I come with a man following me across state lines and a legal situation that's not resolved. I'm aware. I don't know how to do this, any of this. I've been alone for a long time and I've gotten particular about how I manage things. I won't always want help. I'll probably fight you on things I should let go." "Probably," he agreed. "I'm not easy. Neither am I." He held her eyes. "Neither is Lily, for that matter. We're not a particularly easy household." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, the same hands she'd looked at the night he talked about making space, and she thought about all the years the hands had done their work alone, and what it would mean to let that not be the only thing they knew. "I want to stay," she said. "I've wanted to stay since—" She stopped. "Since before I let myself know I wanted it." That's the honest answer. Ethan reached out, slowly without ceremony, the way he did things that weren't meant to make a performance. He put his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment, and then took it back. It was not a grand gesture. It was barely a gesture at all. But it was the kind of thing that lands differently than the large theatrical moments, because it was simply true in the way that small things are true when they're meant. "We'll need to go to the county seat again," he said, "for the actual paperwork, not just Holt's papers. I know. It's a long ride. I've survived long rides. Roy can watch Lily again." He was quiet for a moment. "He said to tell you, by the way, that his wife has a pattern for a kitchen curtain if you want it. She heard about the blue cotton." Clara looked at him. "That's the least romantic sentence anyone has ever said in this context." Something finally broke loose in his face. A real smile this time, short and crooked and so unexpected it almost hurt to look at. "I told you I'm not good at this." "You're better than you think," she said. They stayed out a while longer, in the familiar, comfortable quiet that had been building between them for weeks, and the night was clear and full of stars, and the horses moved softly in the barn, and somewhere out in the scrub something called and was answered, and the ranch, the battered, stubborn living ranch, held them both in the ordinary dark. It was not perfect. The situation with Crow was not resolved. The community opinion was still settling. There were conversations ahead that neither of them was equipped for, and arguments that hadn't happened yet, and all the ordinary difficulty of two people who had spent years managing alone trying to figure out how to manage together. But underneath all of that, solid as the stone foundation of the house, was the fact that she had been seen, clearly, honestly, fully seen, birthmark and history and difficult parts and all, and not found wanting. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She wasn't sure she had the right vocabulary for it, but she could feel it, the way you feel something load-bearing without needing to name the beam. And in the morning, she would still be here. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The filing with Frederick Holt went in on the 1st of October. Clara knew the date because she wrote it in the small notebook she'd been keeping since Missouri. The same notebook with the repair lists and the supply inventories and the kitchen garden notes, where practical things lived alongside the dates that mattered.
October 1st. Filed and received and acknowledged by the clerk at the county office with a stamp and a carbon copy, which Holt had handed to her with the same unhurried manner he applied to everything, as if the weight of the piece of paper was never the paper itself, but what it set in motion. She carried the copy home in her coat pocket. She'd taken it out twice on the ride back, not to read it, she had it memorized, but to hold it. The particular solidity of a thing that was finally, formally, on record. Ethan had noticed her doing it and hadn't said anything, which was the right response. The weeks that followed the filing had a different quality than the waiting before it. Not easier, exactly. Crow hadn't reappeared, but his absence had the particular tension of a held breath, and she still checked the southern ridge every morning out of a habit she couldn't quite break. But the quality of the waiting changed. It had a shape now, a direction. November and the circuit judge were a fixed point on a calendar rather than an abstraction, and Clara had learned over the years that fixed points, even difficult ones, were easier to live with than open uncertainty. She put the energy into the ranch. There was always enough work on the Holloway property to absorb whatever she had to give, and she gave a great deal over those October weeks. The kitchen garden had produced more than she'd expected given the late planting. Winter squash, some late beans, a surprising quantity of beets that she put up in jars she found in the cellar, alongside Margaret's still-sealed preserves. She started a small cold frame against the south wall of the house for the herbs she wanted through winter. She repaired the split in the front room window frame that had been letting cold air in, a job that required more carpentry than she'd initially thought, and resulted in 2 hours of work she was quietly proud of, and that Ethan examined with the focused attention of a man assessing structural integrity before nodding once, which she had learned to read as high praise. She also, in a more careful and deliberate way, kept working on the community, not performing, not trying to win anyone. She'd spent enough of her life managing other people's perceptions to know the difference between working for acceptance and working for it honestly, and she wasn't willing to do the former anymore. But she showed up. She went to the store when things were needed, and she was civil to everyone she encountered, and she did not apologize for existing, which had been, for most of her adult life, her first and most exhausting impulse in any social situation. May Whitfield had been right that it would take about a week. It took closer to 2, but by mid-October the particular quality of silence that had greeted her at Garner's had dissolved into something more ordinary. Nell Garner, who had been the source of most of the initial opinion forming, was still cool but no longer hostile. The women at the dry goods section had graduated from loud conversations about other things to actual conversation with her, initially cautious and then gradually less so. It was not a transformation. It was an adjustment, slow and imperfect, the way communities adjust to things they haven't encountered before. She understood that some people in Garner's Crossing would always see her a certain way. The birthmark, the history, the complicated arrival. And that understanding had stopped being a wound sometime in the past 10 years and had become something more like a fact of landscape. You note it, you work around it, you don't let it decide what you build. What she hadn't expected was Lily. Lily, at 6, had apparently decided that the situation with the school and Sarah Marsh and the lunch table required a resolution, and she had gone about it in a way that was so recognizably Ethan's approach applied through a child's logic that it made Clara's chest ache a little when she heard about it. She'd heard about it from Lily herself, on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered with the matter-of-fact brevity of a mission report. I told Sarah Marsh that my mother has a mark on her face, and that it doesn't mean anything bad, and that she should come see for herself if she wanted to know. Clara looked up from the curtain she was hemming. You said that. Yes. She said her mama said it was different. Lily sat down across from her. I said different isn't the same as wrong. We talked about that. We did. So I used it. Lily picked up a spare piece of fabric and turned it over in her hands. She said she'd think about it. Clara set her work down. She looked at this child, this serious, stubborn, surprisingly brave child, and thought about all the ways the world could shape a person and how it wasn't only the hard things that did the shaping. Lily, she said. Yes? You didn't have to do that. I know. Lily set the fabric down. I wanted to. It was wrong, and it made you sad, even though you didn't say it did. She looked at Clara with the directness she'd gotten from her father. You're my mother now, even if the papers aren't done yet. That's what I think. Clara sat very still for a moment. She had not cried since she'd arrived in Garner's Crossing. She had come close a few times. The first morning Lily had leaned her head against her arm, the night on the porch, when Ethan had put his hand over hers. But she had not cried, because she had a long practice of not letting things that mattered most break the surface in visible ways. It was a survival habit, one of the ones that had kept her functional through years that could have undone her. She could feel it very close now. "The papers will be on soon," she said. Her voice came out mostly steady. "Good," Lily said, with the finality of someone who has finished a piece of business. "Can I help with the curtain?" "Come here," Clara said. "I'll show you the stitch." Mershiktikin. The second week of October brought a cold front down from the north that changed the quality of the air overnight and put frost on the grass by morning. Ethan spent 2 days getting the cattle into the near pasture and checking the windbreak on the north side, and Clara spent those same days putting the house in order for winter with a thoroughness that surprised even her. She'd been in the place 2 months and she was already operating out of a knowledge of its specific needs, its cold corners and its drafts, and the particular way the kitchen range ran hot on the left side that felt like something earned rather than learned. On the second evening of the cold front, with the wind picking up outside and the fire going in the front room, Roy Aldrich came by after supper with news. He came in out of the dark, stamping his boots, and accepted coffee, and said, without preamble, that he'd heard from a man he trusted in town that Silas Crow had been to see a solicitor of his own in the county seat the previous week. Clara set her coffee cup down. "What kind of solicitor?" Ethan asked. "The kind that specializes in debt collection and property claims," Roy said. He looked at Clara. "The man I heard it from is a clerk in the county office. He said Crow had been looking at the territorial statutes on spousal debt. Apparently the fact that you're married changes his angle and he's looking for a new one." "He can't find one," Ethan said. "There's no instrument. There's no legal claim. I know that and you know that. Holt knows it. But a man like Crow doesn't stop because the law is against him. He stops because the cost of continuing is higher than what he gets out of it." Roy wrapped his hands around his cup. "I think he's going to make one more move before the judge comes through. I think he knows if he waits until November, he loses the field entirely." "What kind of move?" Clara asked. Roy looked at her directly. He was that kind of man. No cushioning, but not unkind. "I think he's going to come here again. This time less politely." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows. "He's going to try to make a scene," Clara said. "In front of witnesses, ideally. Something that creates a counter-narrative to what Holt is filing." Roy looked at her with something that was close to respect. "That's my reading, too." "He's done it before," she said. "In Missouri. When he couldn't pressure me privately, he'd create public situations. Make it look like I owed him something in front of people who didn't know the history." She paused. "He's very good at it. He has a manner that reads as reasonable to strangers." Ethan was looking at the fire. "When?" he said. "Could be any time," Roy said. "Before November. My guess is sooner rather than later because the longer he waits, the more settled your position is here." He glanced at Ethan. "I can have someone watching your east approach from my property. You'd have warning." "Do it," Ethan said. Roy left an hour later. Clara and Ethan sat in the front room after he was gone, the fire between them, and she was aware of the particular kind of tired that settles on you when you have been managing a threat for long enough that your body has started to resent the sustained effort. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out before she could decide not to say it. Ethan looked at her. "I know I've said it before and you've told me not to, but I need to say it once more and then I'll stop." She looked at the fire. "I didn't intend for this to be what I brought here. I came with one trunk and a skill set and the intention of being useful, and I've brought a man who won't let go of something that was never his. I know that's not my fault in the way of someone who did wrong, but it's mine in the sense of it being my life following me here." "Clara," he said. "I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine," she said. I know what you're doing," he said. "You're making sure that if I want to change my mind, there's a door open." She looked at him. "You've been doing it since you got here," he said. "Leaving space, making sure I have an out." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want an out. I want you to stop building doors for me to use and trust that when I say I know what I've chosen, I mean it." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's hard for me," she said. "I know. I've been wrong about people before, about whether they'd stay. I know that too. He said it simply, without the performance of patience, just the fact of it. I'm not those people. She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him, which was itself a strange and slightly frightening experience. The way trust always is when it arrives somewhere you'd stopped expecting it. All right, she said. All right, he said. Crow came on a Saturday morning, 12 days before the circuit judge was due. He came with two men she hadn't seen before, ranch hands or hired help, wide-shouldered and deliberately positioned on either side of him when he rode up the track. The three of them stopped in the yard, and Crow stayed on his horse this time, which was a different posture than his first visit and meant something. Height was control. He was recalibrating. Ethan was outside already, which was not an accident. Roy's man had seen them on the east approach and sent word with enough time that Ethan had been able to get Clara and Lily inside, get Roy himself there, and position himself in the yard in the particular unhurried way of a man who has been expecting something and is not surprised. Roy was at the corner of the barn. He didn't make himself obvious, but he was there. Clara watched from the kitchen window. Lily was in the root cellar. She had gone there herself, quietly, when Clara told her what was happening, and she had taken her book and the lantern from the kitchen shelf and gone down the cellar steps without being asked twice. The hiding spot behind the potato shelf, offered weeks ago in that serious 6-year-old voice, was ready. In the yard, Crow looked down at Ethan from his horse. Mr. Holloway. Crow. Ethan's voice carried through the window. I told you not to come back. I have a legitimate matter to discuss. The pleasant manner was on again, the surface reasonableness he deployed for audiences. I understand you've filed papers with the county. I'd like to discuss those privately before this goes further. There's nothing to discuss. I think there is. Crow glanced at the house, at the kitchen window where Clara was standing, with the particular quality of a look that was meant to be noticed. The woman you're calling your wife has obligations that predate your arrangement with her. I've been patient. I've tried to resolve this quietly. I'm here to make a final offer before I'm forced to contest the filing publicly. Contest it all you want, Ethan said. You'll be doing it in front of Judge Harlan Birch in November, with Frederick Holt presenting documentation that establishes you have no claim, legal or otherwise, on any person residing on this property. Something shifted in Crow's expression. The pleasantness thinned. A filing isn't a judgment, he said. No, Ethan agreed, but it starts a process you can't stop. And while that process is running, what you're doing right now, coming to a man's property with hired company after being told to stay off it, that's going into a document too, with Roy Aldrich as a witness. He nodded toward the barn. Roy stepped into sight casually, with the ease of a man who's been comfortable a long time in his own skin. And the ranch hand you passed on the East Road works for Roy, so there's a third. Crow looked at Roy. He looked at the ranch hand who'd presumably materialized somewhere behind the men he'd brought. He recalculated. She could see it from the window, the subtle readjustment, the internal ledger being updated. This isn't over, he said. It is from where I'm standing, Ethan said. You came here twice now, and twice you found a situation you didn't expect. I'd think about what that pattern means for November. He paused. Clara Bennett has people now. That's a new variable for your calculation. I'd take it seriously. One of the men Crow had brought shifted in his saddle. The other was looking at Roy with the particular assessment of a man determining whether a conflict was worth its cost. Neither of them, Clara thought, looked like men who would take serious risk for someone else's grudge if the odds started looking unfavorable. Crow seemed to understand this about his own hired company. He looked at the house one more time, at the window. At her. She didn't move away from the window. She stood there and looked back at him, and she thought about all the years she had looked away when he looked at her. All the years the looking had been enough to make her step back and recalibrate her own position. She thought about the note she'd kept for 12 years in the bottom of her trunk, and the document Holt had filed, and the braid Lily asked for every morning, and the rocking chair on the porch, and the coffee that came out right now, and the man standing in the yard who had said she had people. She looked back at Silas Crow, and she did not step back. He turned his horse. His two men followed. The three of them rode back down the track and did not look behind them, and Clara watched until they were gone from sight, and then watched the empty track for a full minute more, just to be sure. Then she went to the cellar door. Lily, she called down, you can come up. Lily came up the steps with her book under her arm, and the lantern still lit even though it wasn't necessary, and she handed the lantern to Clara and looked at her face and said, "Is he gone?" "He's gone." Lily nodded once, the same single nod her father used for things he'd processed and set aside. "Good," she said, and went to put the lantern back on its shelf. The circuit judge arrived on a Tuesday in November, 3 days ahead of schedule, which was apparently his habit and which Frederick Holt had apparently accounted for by filing 2 weeks early. Judge Harlan Birch was 70 years old and had been riding the circuit for 30 of them, and he had, as Roy Aldrich said without elaboration, seen most things. He held court in the back room of the Garners Crossing Town Hall for 2 days, working through a list of matters that had accumulated since his last visit. Clara and Ethan's filing was not the most significant thing on his docket by a distance. There were land disputes and estate matters, and a question about water rights that had apparently been generating correspondence for 2 years. But Holt had prepared it well, and the presentation was clear. Crow appeared. She had expected him to. He had a solicitor with him, a man from the county seat she didn't recognize, and he sat on the other side of the room in the town hall and did not look at her, which was its own kind of statement. Holt presented the documentation. The debt history, the letters, the 12-year-old note in Crow's own handwriting, and the sworn statement Clara had given about the conduct over 7 years, and the 2 witnesses, Roy Aldrich and his ranch hand, to the October visit, and the documentation of the September visit, and the letter Ethan had written to the county clerk the day after Crow first appeared on the property. Crow's solicitor argued. He argued competently, which Clara had expected. Men like Crow didn't hire incompetent help. He raised the question of informal agreements, the question of what constituted an obligation of honor distinct from legal debt, the question of whether the filing was premature given the absence of any formal harassment claim in Missouri. Judge Birch listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions, one of Clara, one of Holt, and one of Crow's solicitor that seemed to come from somewhere unexpected and that made the solicitor hesitate in a way Clara found quietly satisfying. Then the judge made his ruling. It was, as Holt had predicted, a declaratory judgment. No debt existed, legal or informal, between Clara Bennett Holloway and Silas Crow or any entity he represented. Any claim to the contrary was without foundation in law or fact. Furthermore, the pattern of conduct documented in the filing constituted harassment under territorial statute, and any further approach to the property, to the person, or to any third party for the purpose of asserting false claims would constitute grounds for criminal complaint. He said it in the dry, precise language of a man who had said things like this many times and understood that the language was the point, that what made a thing real in a court of law was the words in which it was stated and the authority behind them. Clara held her hands very still in her lap and listened to the words. Crow left the town hall without speaking to anyone. His solicitor followed. She watched them go. The gray coat, the controlled posture, the man who had taken up so much space in her life for so long, and she waited to feel something large, relief or triumph, or the sudden lifting of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like not to have it. What she actually felt was quieter than that. More like the end of a long road in fading light, when you finally see the building you've been walking toward, and it turns out to be smaller than you imagined, because the walking was the thing that had taken everything. It was over. He was gone. The law said so in words she had a copy of. That was real. That was enough. Ethan found her hand under the table and held it briefly, and she let him. They married on a Friday in late November at the county seat, with Roy Aldrich and his wife Dorothea and Tom Riley and May Whitfield as witnesses. It was not a large ceremony. It was not, strictly speaking, a ceremony at all. It was a legal proceeding that took 20 minutes in a room that smelled of old paper and wood stove smoke, conducted by a clerk who had an afternoon's worth of similar proceedings and approached each with consistent professional pleasantness. Lily wore her best dress and held Dorothea Aldrich's hand during the proceeding, because she'd decided this was the appropriate position for a witness of her age and stature, and she watched the whole thing with that focused intensity she brought to significant events. When it was done, she said, quietly but clearly, in the silence that followed the clerk's final words, "About time." May Whitfield made a sound that Clara would later describe as a suppressed laugh, and that May herself denied entirely.
Ethan looked at his daughter with an expression that was part exasperation and mostly love.
Clara bent down and hugged Lily, which was not something she'd done before. She'd always let the child set the terms of physical contact, understanding that trust in that area was earned carefully. And Lily hugged back with the sudden fierce tightness of a child who'd been waiting for permission to do exactly this. They drove home in the late afternoon. The sky was the particular clear cold blue of November in the high country, and the light came in low and sideways and turned everything it touched to copper. Lily fell asleep in the back of the wagon about halfway home, Dorothea Aldrich's spare blanket tucked around her, and Clara and Ethan rode the last miles in a quiet that was different from any quiet they'd had before. Not the careful quiet of two people feeling out the edges of a new situation, but the quieter quiet of people who have passed through something together and are resting on the other side of it.
"How do you feel?" he asked at one point. She thought about it. "Like I forgot to be afraid," she said. He looked at her. "I kept waiting for the fear to come back," she said. "The specific kind. The one that says this is going to be taken away, or it's going to turn into something else, or you're going to find out something about me that changes things." She watched the road. And it didn't come. I kept leaving space for it, and it didn't come. "Maybe you don't have to leave space for it anymore," he said. "Maybe," she said. "I'm still learning that." "So am I," he said. "For different reasons." She looked at him. He was watching the horses, his hands easy on the reins, his profile against the late sky solid and familiar in the way things become familiar when you've been paying attention to them long enough. "Margaret," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "You don't talk about her."
"No." He paused. I'm not avoiding it. It's more that I don't have language for it yet that doesn't feel like it's taking something from somewhere else." He kept his eyes on the horses. "She was a good woman. She was my wife for 7 years, and she built that house and planted that garden and made that quilt, and she deserved more years than she got." "I know," Clara said. "And she's not... What I feel about her doesn't go away. That's not how it works." He glanced at her. "You know that." "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking it to." He was quiet again. Then, "She would have liked you. That's what I think when I let myself think about it." He said it carefully, not as a gift, not as a dramatic statement, but as a fact he'd arrived at through actual consideration. "She had good judgment about people, better than mine. She would have liked you." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the road, at the copper light, at the sleeping child in the back of the wagon. "I'll try to deserve that," she said. "You already do," he said. "That's not a thing you need to earn retroactively." The ranch came into sight as they came over the low ridge. The stone and timber of the house catching the last of the light, the barn, the fence line, the kitchen garden under its frost cover, the rocking chair on the porch. From this distance, it looked like a painting of itself, the kind of image that means home in the most reduced and essential sense of the word. She had come here with one trunk and a skill set and a man she didn't know, and a town full of strangers and a past that had followed her across 3 states. She had come braced for rejection, for the look she'd been getting her whole life, for the possibility that even a practical arrangement made in good faith would turn out to be another version of the same old story. And instead she had gotten this. Not a perfect thing, a real thing. A man who wasn't easy and a child who wasn't easy, and a community that had taken its time arriving at the right opinion, and a house that needed constant work, and a history that had required a judge and a filing and a 12-year-old note kept in the bottom of a trunk. Not smooth, not clean, but real, in the way that things are real when they've been tested and they held. That evening, after Lily was in bed and the fire was going in the front room and the house had settled into its winter sounds, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. The same notebook. She turned to a new page and wrote the date. November, the year, a Friday. And then she sat looking at the blank page below it for a while. She had kept lists in this notebook. Repairs, supplies, dates that mattered. It was a habit from the years alone, the years when keeping track on paper was a way of asserting that things were ordered and manageable even when they weren't. She thought about what to write. What she wanted to write was something about the feeling of the afternoon, the courthouse and the cold blue sky, and Lily asleep in the back of the wagon, and the quality of the quiet on the last miles home. But she'd never been a person who wrote feelings down. She wasn't built that way, or the years had built her out of it, and she wasn't sure there was a difference. She wrote instead, North fence holding, kitchen garden under, curtains finished, winter stores adequate. Then she stopped, looked at what she'd written, added one more line, arrived here with nothing I could count on. Built something I can. She closed the notebook. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to the front room where Ethan was sitting near the fire, not in the rocking chair which had stayed on the porch, but in the plain wooden chair he usually took, with his legs stretched toward the heat and a tiredness on him that was the clean kind, the end of a real day kind. She sat down across from him. The fire popped and settled. Outside the wind moved through the cedar and the horses were quiet in the barn, and somewhere far out the coyotes were talking to each other in the dark, and the world was cold and wide and went on forever in every direction, but the room was warm. This is what she had learned in the months between the stagecoach and this evening. Not a lesson she could wrap in clean language, it was more ragged than that, more earned. She had learned that a person can carry a history of being unwanted for so long that they forget the carrying is optional, that the ability to leave space for people to exit is not the same as wisdom. Sometimes it's just old fear wearing a practical coat, that a birthmark on a face, or a past that followed you across state lines, or the inconvenient truth of who you are does not determine what you deserve. It only determines who has the courage to see past it. Most people don't. That is true. Most people make their decisions about you in the first 10 seconds and spend the rest of their time confirming those decisions. But some people look again. Some people have the specific stubbornness of character that refuses the first reading and insists on the second and the third. They are rarer than the other kind, but they exist, and they are worth the 3-state journey and the difficult year and the long, frightening wait to find out whether you've finally arrived at the right place. Ethan was asleep in his chair. He'd gone under fast, the way people do when they're genuinely tired, with the absolute trust of the body that knows it's somewhere safe. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had driven her home from a stagecoach without a word about a birthmark, who had picked up a trunk and said, "Come on," who had called her his wife out loud to a man who frightened her and meant it before the law caught up to the meaning. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm, the way he'd put his hand over hers on the porch that night. Just for a moment. He didn't wake. The fire crackled. The wind outside was just the wind. She sat with the warmth of it and let herself, for once, simply stay.